We're speaking with Charles Thomson. Tell us how this all happened.
It began really in March when I received a tip-off as to when and where Michael Jackson would be flying into the UK to announce his London concert. I worked with The Sun on that story. We had the exclusive. That tip-off came from someone in Michael Jackson's camp, and they asked me to leak that story for them to the press because they wanted publicity surrounding the concert announcement. After that, I continued to work on Michael Jackson's stories with The Sun, and I was blogging at the same time, but nothing serious. And then when the Evan Chandler suicide was announced in November, I was working on the story with The Sun, and they asked me to send them information about the 1993 allegations, which I did. And I advised them of all the myths, the common myths which appear in the popular media and how they should avoid them. And I sourced all of my information from court documents and audio-visual evidence. And I sent that into The Sun. And when I read the story the next day, it completely discarded all of my information and replaced it with incorrect information. And I was so incensed by that I wrote a blog about it called Chandler's Suicide Highlights Media Bias Against Jackson. And I guess some fans found it or something, posted it on a fan site, and it got multiplied and multiplied. And within about a month, if you type the title into Google, it was producing 1.5 million websites. And since then, I've just been writing about Michael Jackson for various places since my work became popular.
Would you mind telling us some of these myths that keep getting perpetrated about, well, actually they're lies, they're not myths, about Michael Jackson? And he seems to be the one person in all of history that is suffering the greatest character assassination of anyone else.
It's a character assassination on a scale that we have never seen before. With regard to the myths about 93, there's three key ones. The first is that Jordan Chandler accused Michael Jackson. That's a myth. Evan Chandler accused Michael Jackson, and Jordan Chandler denied it vehemently for months. There's a great investigative journalist called Mary Fisher who wrote a piece for GQ magazine in 1994 called Was Michael Jackson Framed? And she uncovered compelling evidence that the only reason Jordan Chandler ever changed his story was because he'd been administered with a drug called sodium amytal. His father was a dentist, and it's thought that he used this drug as an anesthetic from time to time. And the drug is known to induce false memory syndrome. So Jordan Chandler vehemently denied these accusations until he was administered with this drug, according to Mary Fisher. The second myth is that Jordan Chandler accurately describes Michael Jackson's genitals. That's a total fiction. At the time, he claimed that Michael Jackson was circumcised, and a police body search concluded that he was not, meaning that Jordan Chandler had changed his story and then gotten the description wrong, which pretty much undermined everything that he had to say on the matter. You know, you had a witness who was a proven liar. You know, he's a proven liar because either he was molested or he wasn't, and he's told both stories. One of them has to be a lie. You know, so you have an inherently untrustworthy witness. So the description was inaccurate, and it's widely reported. To this day, it's constantly alluded to as having been correct. It was not correct. It was inaccurate. And the autopsy, which leaked a couple of months ago, again reiterated that Michael Jackson was not circumcised, whilst Jordan Chandler claimed that he was. The third myth is that Michael Jackson somehow bought his way out of a trial with a settlement. He was never going to stand trial in the first place. People often point to the settlement as the reason that Michael Jackson never stood trial. They neglect to mention that Michael Jackson was under investigation for over half a year before that settlement was ever reached. And with 6 months of investigation, the police never even had enough evidence to arrest him, let alone charge him with a crime. Thomas Snedden, the DA in the case, took his case to 3 separate grand juries, and all of those grand juries refused to allow him to bring charges because his evidence was so feeble. So the media often points to this settlement as saying, oh, Jackson settled because otherwise he would have gone to prison, or Jackson settled because otherwise he would have faced trial. Michael Jackson was never going to face trial. When he settled with the Chandler family, he was not being prosecuted, he was being sued. And by settling with the family, he saved untold amounts of money. That civil suit could have dragged on for years, and not only cost him millions upon millions upon millions in legal fees, but also earnings. The whole time that case was dragging on, he wouldn't have been able to play a concert, he wouldn't have been able to release an album. So those are the 3 myths: that Jordan Chandler was the one who initiated the allegations, that Jordan Chandler accurately described Jackson's genitals, and that Michael Jackson avoided a trial by paying a settlement. And those 3 myths alone are enough to make him look guilty when they're inaccurately reported.
Why do you think that the media persists in this character assassination? What is going on?
I think that there's so many factors, and it's difficult to pinpoint what the primary ones are. I do think that a big part of it is pride. I think that when the 1993 allegations hit, Michael Jackson was typically silent. For much of his adult career, he would not speak to the media, and after 1993, it was no exception. He gave like a 4-minute speech on television, and that was it. And so consequently, all of the information that the media was receiving was coming from the prosecution, either officially or unofficially. So it's questionable how much of it was reliable, how much of it was accurate. And at the time, it's easy to see how they would have been led to believe that Jackson was guilty because they were only getting one side of the story, and it was quite skewed. I think that as the information started to trickle out, okay, it wasn't actually the boy that made the allegations, it was his dad. Okay, he's on tape threatening to extort Michael Jackson out of millions of dollars. Okay, the boy's got the description wrong. It became increasingly apparent that Jackson was actually not guilty, but the media seemed to have already taken this stance that he was, and there's almost an element of pride about it. You know, like they're completely unwilling to admit that they got it wrong, and I think that's one of the primary factors.
Do you think race has a place here?
I often compare the Jackson case to the case of Jack Johnson, which occurred in the early years of the 1900s, and Michael Jackson's trial occurred in the early years of the noughties. And Jack Johnson's media treatment was undeniably racist, and Michael Jackson's media treatment has been undeniably similar. That's the way I always phrase it. I can't say for sure. You know, no journalist has ever come to me and said, oh, hi, you know, I just wanted to tell you that I'm really mean to Michael Jackson because he's black. That's never happened. But, you know, Jack Johnson's treatment was undeniably racist, and Michael Jackson's was undeniably similar. It's like a lynching. You know, I don't know if you know the story of Jack Johnson. Some people probably won't. He was the first black heavyweight boxing champion of the world, and he won the title in around 1907 or 1908. And he was treated horrendously because the media and the establishment couldn't accept the idea of a black icon, a black champion. And he was assassinated by the media in almost a blow-for-blow identical way to Michael Jackson, right down to 2 separate allegations of sexual misconduct, the first resulting in a settlement, the second resulting in a trial. He was treated horrendously. They called him names like, well, a lot of racist names that I don't really want to say on the radio, but they also called him Jackie. They used to call him Little Jackie, like a kid, you know, rather than an adult. And I always think you skip forward 100 years, and Jackie has just become Jacko. All that's changed in 100 years is a syllable. You know, I do think that there's an argument to be made that race played a part. You have to consider the circumstances as well. You know, Jack Johnson was a black champion, 50 years before segregation was lifted. Michael Jackson was a black man who owned the Beatles and outsold Elvis in an era when MTV still wouldn't even put African Americans on its TV channel. So he was a racial trailblazer. He was a pioneer in that field. And I think it would be short-sighted to state for certain that race didn't play a factor.
Well, let's fast forward to the trial that happened with the Arvizo family, and can you just put out some of those facts for us?
Oh boy, that whole trial was it would have been hilarious if it wasn't so tragic. I mean, it was a farce. The whole thing was a farce. The boy kept changing his story. He went to the police. He said he'd been molested 5 or 6 times. Then he said it was 1 or 2 times. Who can't tell the difference between being molested 1 and 6 times? That's ridiculous. You have the fact that they had all been complicit in false allegations of sexual molestation in the past. There was evidence that the children had been coached to lie on the stand in the past. They had lied for financial gain in the past. They were a family of grifters. They'd concocted these allegations that they were molested by J.C. Penney security staff and extorted a massive amount of money out of J.C. Penney. The mother took the stand and declared that the Germans. She just kept referring to the Germans, this non-specific. Oh, the Germans did it. She kept claiming that Michael Jackson and the Germans were going to abduct her children and fly them to Africa in a hot air balloon or something. The woman was just raving bonkers. The whole case didn't add up. The prosecution kept calling witnesses to testify for them who would have nothing interesting to say. Quite notably, they called what they referred to as 5 former victims of Michael Jackson. 3 of them took the stand and said, "He never touched me and I resent the implications." 1 of them took the stand and said, "Once Michael Jackson was tickling him and extremely briefly brushed against his crotch, which could easily have been accidental." And the 5th didn't even show up. The 5th was Jordan Chandler, who he by this point had gained legal emancipation from his parents. His mother took the stand and testified that she hadn't heard from him in 11 years. And he actually left the country. Thomson wanted him to testify against Michael Jackson, but Jordan Chandler left the country rather than do that. And had he taken the stand, Thomas Mesereau, Michael Jackson's lawyer, had several witnesses lined up who were prepared to testify that in recent years Jordan Chandler had insisted that Jackson never touched him and that he hated his parents for making him say that he had, and that was why he gained legal emancipation. So even these 5 former victims turned out to be a completely farcical move on behalf of the prosecution. Then you had this hilarious conspiracy charge where they tried to prove that Michael Jackson had tried to kidnap the boy. They claimed that he'd held the boy and his family captive at Neverland, even though logs showed that the family had been entering and exiting Neverland of their own accord all the time. They'd been making phone calls to whoever they wanted. The whole thing, it just didn't make sense. All of these charges, they had no evidence whatsoever to support any of their charges, and they were caught trying to plant evidence, which is often brushed over by the media. During the grand jury testimony before the trial, Thomas Snedden brought out some girly magazines that had been found at Michael Jackson's house. And they were not wrapped up in anything. They were not in plastic bags. They were not in evidence bags. And he handed them to the kids on the stand and said, "Is this the magazine that you saw at Jackson's house? Do you remember seeing this magazine?" And then he took those magazines after he'd handed them to the kids on the stand, and he sent them for fingerprint analysis, and they found the kids' fingerprints on them, which of course they would, because they'd just handled them in court. But he tried to brush over that. That evidence was not admitted in the end because it was realized that the fingerprints had been put on the magazines afterwards. But he took those magazines and he gave them to the kids on the stand, and then he sent them off for fingerprint analysis to see if their kids' fingerprints were on them, which is a blatant example of the prosecution trying to plant evidence against Michael Jackson. That is how feeble their case was.
And it's quite interesting to note that there were over 2,000 so-called journalists covering the trial. It was a circus outside the courtroom, yet day by day they would not report what actually went on in the courtroom. You want to talk about that?
Well, if even just hearing that number, 2,000 journalists, that courtroom did not hold 2,000 journalists. The courtroom would barely have held 100 journalists, because that's the size of the courtroom. The courtroom is not designed to hold many people. So you have 2,000 journalists stood outside the courtroom reporting on this trial, and only 100 of them, if that, have actually been inside. That's the level of reporting that you had about this trial. Thomas Mesereau was dismayed. He was completely dismayed. He would go home at the end of the day, he said in a couple of interviews afterwards, having had a really successful day in court. And he would switch on court TV, and there would be a panel of supposed experts who were not even inside the courtroom, giving their analysis, giving their comments, making these allegations about the day in court that they had not even witnessed, they had not even been there. The trial was poorly covered for that reason. It was, you have 2,000 journalists vying for seats inside a courtroom that probably holds about 100 people tops. And that is why the reporting on the trial was so poor. And it's also why Aphrodite Jones's book is so good, because she was actually given a permanent seat for every day of the trial. Her book, Michael Jackson Conspiracy, kind of reveals the side of the trial that we were never told about. The positive days, which, when we read about them, were turned into negative days. The positive testimony that by the time they reached us was turned into negative testimony. She gives you the facts. She tells you in her book what really happened inside the courtroom, and the fact that she was actually inside plays a big part in that. It's just absurd. It's absurd to have these 2,000 journalists claiming that they're covering a trial when they're not even inside the courtroom. What are they even doing? Just standing around outside the courtroom. It's just absurd.
And in fact, she had a change of conscience. She started out being one of those accusers and had an epiphany experience, realizing he wasn't guilty. And you want to talk about that a bit?
Yeah, I actually interviewed Aphrodite Jones back when her book came out. That was in 2008, and I wrote a piece about it. And she told me that the reason she had presumed Jackson was guilty was because she arrived at the trial late. She arrived a couple of days late because she'd been off covering another big trial, the Scott Peterson trial or something. And so when she got there, she asked the rest of the press to kind of, what's been going on, can you bring me up to date? And they were all kind of laboring under this illusion that Jackson was obviously guilty because of the 93 settlement. They all walked into the trial wanting Jackson to be guilty and believing that he was guilty. And so they allowed that to skew their reporting on the trial. If you watch the trial through those eyes, then you will pick out the little sound bites that you think support that theory. It's kind of natural, I suppose. It's just the way your brain works. And then her moment of epiphany actually came on verdict day. The verdict had been read, and she was live on Fox News via a satellite link. And Bill O'Reilly asked her, do you think they made the right decision? And in that moment, she said she thought about it, and she just thought about the evidence and the testimony, and she said, well, Bill, I have to say yes, I think they did. And in that moment, she completely reevaluated her stance on the Jackson trial. And that's when she went off and started researching her book, which is very good. I really do recommend it, Michael Jackson Conspiracy by Aphrodite Jones.
And it's interesting to note also that when all those not guilty verdicts came in, they were never examined by those 2,000 so-called journalists. Why did these not guilty verdicts come in? They just went on to the next thing. It wasn't even looked at.
Yeah, that is true. And the reason for that is because the media was slightly humiliated by the verdicts because they had been making this concerted effort for the past 4 months or something. The trial was about 4 months long. They've been making this concerted effort to try to portray Jackson as guilty, twisting the testimony, picking out tiny sound bites which misrepresent the testimony. This kind of, if Jackson had a good day in court, if Jackson had a bad day in court, for instance, so it's a prosecution witness and Tom Sneddon or Ron Vernon is interviewing them, then what that is essentially, that's just a chance for the prosecution to get their witness to make their allegation. That's just a chance for the boy to come on the stand and make all these graphic allegations. And of course that gets run as a double page spread in most newspapers. He slid his hand down my pants, says boy, or whatever. And, you get all these graphic descriptions and pictures, drawings of the witness looking all sympathetic. And then the next day, Thomas Mesereau will take the floor and destroy that witness, catch him out in lies, prove that he's lied in the past, prove that he's lied about sexual molestation in the past, pick up the grand jury testimony and say, well, yesterday you said this, but in the grand jury testimony you said that. Yesterday you said this, but in the police interview you said that. He caught him out in lie after lie after lie, including big lies. Lies about, he said that Michael Jackson had told him that all boys have to masturbate because otherwise they'll rape people. And it turned out that Michael Jackson had never said that to him. He admitted on the stand that his grandmother had actually said that to him. Enormous lies, which would, in most people's eyes, be the difference between thinking Jackson is innocent or guilty. And then when that happens, the media is kind of embarrassed about the fact that 1 day or 2 days previously, they ran this big double-page spread, which kind of portrayed Jackson as guilty. And now, actually, the defense team has completely destroyed that witness. And so what they do is, rather than saying, oops, we got it wrong, oops, yesterday's story was a big pile of rubbish, here's the fact, they just go, right, we'll stick that, 3 paragraphs on page 27 under a Specsavers advert, or whatever. They give it comparatively no airtime or no space in the newspaper or the magazine. If they feel, it's a bit like 93, they're not willing to prepare, they're not prepared to admit that they were incorrect. They're not prepared to admit that yesterday's story wasn't actually accurate. And so when those verdicts came in, the media was mortified because despite all their efforts, despite, systematically portraying Jackson as guilty, the verdict still came in as they should have done, and the media knew that that's what the verdict should have been all along. And probably, I imagine as well, they were all geared up for a guilty verdict. They probably had all these packages made up, Jackson in dark lighting with sinister music, and all these pre-recorded VTs. And I imagine that they were so confident that they had successfully skewed the verdict that they didn't even bother to make an alternative for if he was found not guilty. So I think it's a combination of the fact that they were humiliated by the verdict, and they probably felt, the media as a whole probably felt quite emasculated by the verdict because it undermined them because they'd been so concertedly trying to portray him as guilty. And also, I think they just weren't prepared for the verdict because they were so confident that they had been successful in skewing the verdict.
How much do you know how much was spent on the prosecution total?
Millions. I don't know the exact amount, but it was millions. Thomas Mesereau famously said repeatedly since the trial that team of prosecutors, that police force, spent more money and put more resources into trying to convict Michael Jackson than have ever been put into catching any serial killer. They spent atrocious amounts of money on the prosecution of Michael Jackson, right down to setting up hotlines so that supposed victims could call in. After the allegations broke in 2003, they set up these hotlines so you could call in and claim that you were molested by Michael Jackson. And they received thousands of calls and every single one of them was found to have absolutely no validity whatsoever. In addition to these hotlines, they built a website with Michael Jackson's mugshot on it, almost like a prize, like chopping the head off of a lion after you've shot it, and sticking it on the wall. They took this mugshot and they kind of mocked him by setting up this special website with his mugshot on it. Like, look what we did to Michael Jackson. Then you have the DA Tom Sneddon spending enormous amounts of money, just traveling to all different continents, looking for victims. This was the definition. This was the dictionary definition of a malicious prosecution. You have a prosecutor traveling around the world looking for victims of Michael Jackson. That's how obsessed he was. It's not, okay, somebody's come to us and they've made a legitimate allegation, so we're going to try it. It's, let's travel halfway around the world looking for anyone who's going to say something nasty about Michael Jackson. They spent, it was millions. I can't remember exactly how much, although I imagine it was very profitable overall for the community. You have, like you said earlier, 2,000 journalists, plus their cameramen, plus their drivers, plus their assistants, plus their makeup artists and their hairdressers and their, sound technicians. Thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people coming to Santa Barbara for months on end, staying in hotels, hiring parking spaces, hiring satellite van spaces, buying food, going out to the nightclubs and the bars. So although the prosecution spent a phenomenal amount of money trying to pin something on Michael Jackson, they also, for the community, made a hell of a lot of money because it attracted so many people to the area for so long.
And Aphrodite Jones, when it came time for her to assemble all this material, she looked at all the court documents, and she wrote a book, and the publishers would not publish a positive book about Michael Jackson, even though she had how many bestsellers?
She'd had, by that point, I think, 7 New York Times top 10 bestsellers. She was a very respected true crime writer. And when she went to the publishers and she said, look, I've done all this research, I spent 6 months. She spent 6 months reading the transcripts and writing the book. She put so much research into this book, she had to buy a second computer because she couldn't, her one computer couldn't hold her research and her writing at the same time. That's how much effort and research she put into this book. And although it was completely grounded in fact, it was completely rooted in the trial transcript. She went to the courthouse, she photographed, photocopied every page of every trial transcript. She took pictures of all of the evidence. And the publishers just weren't interested. They just kept telling her, if it's pro-Jackson, then we don't want it. But I think more telling than the Aphrodite Jones situation is the Thomas Mesereau situation. Mesereau being Jackson's lawyer. He was actually offered book deals. Aphrodite Jones was out looking for a book deal. Thomas Mesereau was offered book deals by every major publishing company in America. But when he told them that he would not, that he was not a turncoat, when he told them, I will not say that I believe Michael Jackson is guilty, every single publishing company retracted its offer. They were only prepared to give him a book deal if he said something nasty about Michael Jackson.
It's just astounding. It's a case for just looking at how mass media operates, and even publishing. When you look at the books that are available about Michael Jackson out there, many of them are smear books, and there's not. If you read several of these books, you come to know that they're not well written. They're full of inaccuracies and lies. Let's talk about books on Michael Jackson from your point of view, Charles Thomson.
A phenomenal amount has been written about Michael Jackson. Huge amounts. Much of it very lazy. You know, in the aftermath of Michael Jackson's death, pretty much every publishing company seemed to be just churning out biographies within about 2 weeks. You know, and I mean, if you're going to write a biography of someone in 2 weeks, how good can it be? You know, it just can't. You can't write a good biography. You can't even write a good biography in 2 months, let alone 2 weeks. So these books, those books particularly, anything which has come out since Michael Jackson died, pretty much is just drivel. You know, just badly researched, rushed drivel. You know, but a lot of what was written before Michael Jackson died was drivel as well. And part of it is because he was so secretive, and he was so unwilling to speak to the press and to speak to writers that they kind of, I think some of them kind of had it in for him because they felt that it was a slight, you know, you can see it, you can trace it with a finger on a timeline, you know, the less Jackson spoke to the press, the more malicious they got, perhaps because they thought, you know, this guy is so famous, why wouldn't he give us a piece of the pie? You know, all it takes is three sentences or something, and we've got a front page story. But also, I think the fact that he was so quiet for most of his adult career just made it difficult for people to track down the truth. And when you make things difficult for some journalists, they just get lazy. Rather than doing their jobs, rather than doing the difficult research, they just go, oh, I'll just write what I want. You know, I mean, a classic example is Ian Halperin's book. Now, elements of Ian Halperin's book seem to be accurate, but it's just full of these glaring inaccuracies, stories that were disproved even before Jackson died. You know, he has these stories in his book, for instance, that Michael Jackson didn't show up at rehearsals for the This Is It concerts. And now we have the This Is It film, which clearly shows that he did. You know, he has stories in his book that Jackson couldn't sing anymore and couldn't dance anymore. We see in This Is It that he could. He had a story in his book that he claimed he'd seen Michael Jackson's contract and he was only due to be on stage for 15 minutes a night at the O2 concerts or something. Whereas you look at This Is It, and again, you can clearly see that Jackson is rehearsing about 10 songs, minimum, you know? So, I mean, his book is just riddled with inaccuracies, which were actually disproven before it was even published. And for some reason, they published it with those inaccuracies still in it anyway. That's how lazy the publishing industry is, you know?
And Ian Halperin is paraded out there as a Michael Jackson expert on mass media TV.
Yeah, that's quite correct. He is, you know, and like I said, there are elements of his book which are accurate, but most of the accurate parts of his book and reliable parts are actually just already well-established information, which you can read in Randy Taraborelli's book, or Aphrodite Jones's book, or Mary Fisher's GQ article. In terms of new material in Ian Halperin's book, in terms of actual journalism, him actually going out and finding information, finding facts, there is just, you know, it's just completely inaccurate. You have all these claims about the This Is It concerts, every single one of which is completely disproven by the film, apart perhaps from the stories that Jackson was ill, which you wouldn't see in the film. But, you know, you can clearly see that Jackson wasn't rehearsing for only 13 minutes. You know, that's ludicrous. And you can see that Jackson was at rehearsals, because if he wasn't, then there wouldn't be any video of him. You know, these stories, it just amazes me, it baffles me. I ordered his book when it came out. I pre-ordered it, and it arrived, you know, on the day that it was due out. And I read it in a day, because I was hoping that it would be interesting and informative, but really it was just full of rehashed information and completely inaccurate reporting. And it just astounds me that the publishing industry would allow a book like that to go to print.
And then there wouldn't be stories about the inaccuracies in it. It's let's talk about the what's happening now in print journalism and journalism on the web. This copy and paste idea, where someone will say some kind of salacious thing, and it'll get out there on one outlet, and then it'll be picked up by. Tell us what you found about that?
I did write a piece about that just 2 weeks ago, I think, for the Huffington Post, which is exactly about that, exactly about copy and paste journalism. At the beginning of February, Gene Simmons of Kiss, the band Kiss, made some allegations about Jackson in an interview with Classic Rock magazine, and he said, completely inaccurate. He said Michael Jackson was on tape ordering alcohol for children, which of course he was not. That was never produced in court. Jackson was in court on misdemeanor charges of providing alcohol to a minor. If that tape had ever existed or been played in court, then he would have been found guilty on those charges. There was, it just didn't happen. It just did not happen. I don't know where Gene Simmons got it from. It seems to be a figment of his imagination, but it just didn't happen. He said that at Jackson's trial, a travel agent had taken the stand and testified to flying in boys from Brazil for Jackson's amusement. Again, that is a complete fiction. That just did not happen. That testimony was never heard at Jackson's trial. So I don't know what it is. I don't know if he's maybe going senile or if he's just making it up because he thinks it will earn him column inches or something. But it just did not happen. Just didn't happen. And the last comment he made was that he knew a musician on a Jackson tour who had quit because they kept seeing young boys in the hotel. Which I'll come to in a second. So these comments that he made in Classic Rock go up on Google News. Classic Rock releases it as a trailer for their new issue, and it goes on Google News. So somebody sees it on Google News and goes, oh, that's a salacious story about Michael Jackson. That'll get people clicking onto my website. I'll have that. Copy and paste it. Well, now it's on 2 websites on Google News, so it raises up the rankings, which means more people find it, which means more people say, oh, that's an interesting story about Michael Jackson, which will get people to come to my website. Copy and paste, copy and paste, copy and paste. Now you've got 10 outlets. You've got 10 outlets reporting this inaccurate story about Michael Jackson. Now it's on the front page of Google News because it's been reported by 10 outlets. So even more people see it and copy and paste it onto their websites. And before you know it, you have these dozens of outlets who are just reproducing these allegations with absolutely no attempt to fact-check them. And it's not difficult. They could contact someone like me. They could contact someone like Aphrodite Jones or Thomas Mesereau, who would just say, no, that testimony, it just didn't exist. That just didn't happen. I don't know where you're getting that from. With regard to the comment about on the road with Michael Jackson, I easily fact-checked that as well. I went to Jennifer Batten, who was Michael Jackson's guitarist on every single one of his tours. So she toured with him on and off for a decade. Whenever Jackson was on the road, she was with him. And I just said, do you have any recollection of anyone quitting a Jackson tour ever? And she said, no. Not only did nobody quit a Jackson tour for that reason, nobody quit a Jackson tour full stop. That's just a complete fiction. I was on every Jackson tour, nobody ever quit. So there you have, that draws a line under all of Gene Simmons' claims. Every single thing that he said was proven to be inaccurate. And it was so easy to disprove. Because all I did was I typed, you go to Google, you type in Michael Jackson tour guitarist, and up comes Jennifer Batten. You click on her website, and there's an email me button. How difficult is that? Why is the media so lazy? You're talking 40 seconds on Google and another 30 to write the email. It's just so lazy. It's unbelievably lazy. This copy and paste journalism. I know, because of the recession and the rise of the internet, there is less money. There's less money in the news industry. Journalists are being fired, so you've got less journalists trying to fill more space, which means they have less time to spend on their stories. But it's just ridiculous. They're not so pushed for time that they can't spend 40 seconds on Google and 30 seconds writing an email just to fact check. That's the fundamental of journalism. Just fact check. If Gene Simmons says this about Michael Jackson, then don't just print it because you don't know whether it's true. I think the attitude is, oh, well, he said it, not us. But that's not really the point. It's still bad journalism. It was so easy for me to fact check those allegations and disprove them. But rather than doing that, the media just copy-paste, and all of a sudden it's all over the world. It's in India, it's in Australia, it's in the USA, it's in the UK, it's everywhere, And then, as if to add insult to injury, I tracked down Jennifer Batten. I got that denial from her. I got her to elaborate on that. I gave it to a news outlet, and they put it on Google News. And whereas dozens of people picked up the salacious story about Jackson, within 2 weeks, only 4 news outlets in the world were carrying Jennifer Batten's retraction, which basically says, the media is willing to publish any baseless but salacious allegation about Michael Jackson, but they're unwilling to print the facts which disprove those allegations. It's just blatant bias. It's just unbelievable. It's right there in your face. They just make no attempt. It's unashamed. They make no attempt to disguise the fact that they are actively biased against Michael Jackson. And I just find that astounding.
Well, you wrote a piece in the Huffington Post, Michael Jackson, it's time for outlets to take responsibility in covering the rock star. What kind of response did you get to that?
The media, in terms of media response, none. Because, apart from you asking me for this interview, because it highlights everything that they're doing wrong. They're not going to call me up. The New York Times is not going to call me up and say, "Oh, hi, Charlie, could you just write us a piece about how we're really biased?" Or, "Hi, I saw you wrote that piece in the Huffington Post about how crap our journalism is. Can you give us an interview about it?" Because it just highlights their shortcomings. In terms of public response, there are lots of comments underneath the Huffington Post article. I would say probably 95% of which are positive. Jackson seems to have this following of obsessive detractors. People who just you wonder what's gone wrong in their lives, why they've got nothing better to be doing, because they literally just seem to trawl around the internet, typing Michael Jackson into Google, finding pages with his name on, and then writing nasty comments about it, which is quite unbelievable, and then turning on anyone who writes anything in his favor as well. But in terms of public response, particularly to the Huffington Post piece, it has been positive, which I think should just send a message to the media. People, because the media, they often use this excuse, we're just giving the people what they want. We're just giving the public what they want. But if the public response to my Huffington Post article is anything to go by, then they're not giving the people what they want, because I've got hundreds of people writing underneath it that they're so relieved and so thankful that somebody's writing the truth about Michael Jackson for once, So, yeah, the response has been largely, almost overwhelmingly positive.
I know that there's also a negative reaction to your work, false claims made about you, and is this from these fanatics that are out to point a finger at Michael?
There are a couple of. It happens to anyone who takes Jackson's side. You do have these kind of militantly anti-Jackson, posters on the internet, and they try to discredit anyone. I think they find me threatening because a lot of the people who write in Michael Jackson's favor are overtly fans. They kind of obsessive. They use religious language sometimes. They describe him as an angel or whatever, and they find me threatening. I think because I'm not like that. I am a journalist. I'm an accredited journalist. I don't portray Jackson as a martyr. Some of them describe me as a flu. I don't know where that word's come from. FLOON, like I'm some kind of crazed fan. But I don't even like all of Jackson's albums. I don't even like all of his tours. I'm not some crazed fan. Did I like Off the Wall and Thriller? Yes. Did I have tickets to This Is It? Yes. But did I camp outside his house every day? No. I'm not some kind of crazed fan. I'm just a regular person who enjoys some of Jackson's work. And they tried to portray me as this in their words, floon, and there are people who claim that I don't exist. They claim that I'm some kind of composite, created by the fans, as a front for them. There are people who claim that I am actually a writer called Deborah French. There's another British writer called Deborah French who covers the same territory as me sometimes. And these people, they claim baselessly that Deborah and I are the same person. I've spoken to Deborah. I've spoken to her on the phone. She definitely exists, and she's definitely not me. So it amazes me because they tried to discredit my research, although all of my research pretty much is sourced directly from official documents, whether it be FBI files, trial transcripts, grand jury testimony, police documents or whatever. And if I don't source it from there, then I source it from reliable books like J. Randy Taraborelli's Michael Jackson biography. And so on the one hand, they're trying to claim that my research is poor, and on the other hand, they're claiming without any evidential basis, with no basis in reality, that I don't even exist, or they're claiming with no evidential basis that I am the same person as Deborah French, or they're claiming, whatever. It's just like they're claiming that I'm some kind of deranged fan. They have no evidential basis for any of these statements. It just amazes me how desperate they are to discredit anyone who says anything pro-Jackson. I think a lot of that is racially motivated. A lot of it is I can't really tell you where it comes from, but there just do seem to be this relatively small amount of Jackson detractors who put themselves all over the internet trying to discredit anything pro-Jackson. I don't quite understand what their motivation would be, or, what went so tragically wrong in their lives that they've got nothing better to be doing with their time. But they just seem to be militant and obsessive. They call Jackson's fans obsessive, and yet they are the ones typing his name into Google every day and spamming all of his websites with nasty messages. How obsessive is that? So I really don't take much notice of them, to be honest. I don't engage with them. I'm lucky enough that they haven't started emailing me or anything. They've kept it all on websites like Topics. I would prefer that they weren't out there making these stupid claims, that I don't exist and stuff, because that's not very good for me, in terms of getting work, getting business. If people type my name into Google and the first thing they find is that I don't exist. But
well, we're speaking with soul funk music specialist Charles Thomson, a real journalist who's based in England, and I know that you're somewhat of an authority on James Brown, and last week there came out a story that his body was stolen. What do you know about that?
Yeah, I have to say, I was up working quite late on, I think it was on Thursday night. I was up, it was about 3 a.m. in the UK, and I was just about to go to bed, and I just clicked on Google News to see what the top stories were, and I almost jumped out of my chair because there was a story on the Daily Mail website that James Brown's body had been snatched, stolen from its tomb. And, I can't claim to have been a friend of James Brown's, but I did meet him, I did exchange words with him, I did see him live several times, and I've done a lot of work on him since he passed away. And I do know people who were close to him. I know people that saw him on a daily basis. I know people that worked with him, toured with him. And I was thinking also how they were going to react to this news. It's just the idea of stealing a body anyway, grave robbing, essentially, is so despicable and disturbing. I couldn't believe it. I had to go to bed, and it was a strange time to start calling anyone anyway. But the next day I did speak to Mr. Brown's son, Darryl Brown, who was his tour guitarist, and he basically said to me, look, this story is not true. The allegations are being made by a lady who is essentially a love child. She came forward after James Brown died, took a DNA test, and it was found that she was more likely his daughter than not. But, she doesn't really have any family ties. She's not even been to the crypt. So the family released a statement later that day. But what you find, if you type it into Google, the media they're still kind of going, oh, there's a controversy surrounds whether or not James Brown's body has been stolen. His body has not been stolen. There's no controversy. His body has just not been stolen. One woman said that it had been, and now the family has authoritatively dismissed that claim. So yeah, the body has not been stolen. I spoke to Mr. Brown's family in the last couple of days, and the body is where it should be.
So another case of media lies, inaccuracies.
Not necessarily lies, because this lady did contact the media under her own volition and tell them that the body was missing. And I suppose they thought she was an authoritative source because she is his daughter, officially. So I can see why they went with the story, because it is a truly shocking story, and they seem to have a rock-solid source. But as it turns out, this lady, although she is technically Brown's daughter, she was not officially his daughter until after he died. She has no ties to the family. She's not been to the crypt. And they don't quite understand what her motivation is, but they just say, basically, there's no way she could possibly be an authoritative source on whether or not the body's been moved, because she's not even been to the crypt. So, officially, the body has not been moved, and I just wish the media's real shortcoming is in not reporting that widely enough, rather than still speculating over whether it's been stolen or not, which I suppose is more interesting. They should just, again, I feel sometimes like whenever one of these stories comes out about some kind of black icon, it's left to me to deny it. Gene Simmons' comments go all around the world. It's left to me to ring up Jennifer Batten and get the denial and put it out there. The story goes around the world about James Brown's body. It's left to me to do the most basic of fact-checking, ring up the family and ask if it's true. It's basic fact-checking. It just alarms me that the media is so lazy that they won't do this basic fact-checking. I think I was the first person to actually put out a denial by the family. The Augusta Chronicle put out a denial by the funeral parlor, but I think I was the first person in the world to put out a denial by the family, and the only person in the world for quite some time as well, because the media was just not picking up on it.
Charles, thank you so much. I can't believe we've reached 1 a.m., and I thank you so much. People that would like to read your writing, you've got a website. Do you want to direct them to it?
Yeah, my website is www.charles, that's CHARLES, Thomson, THOMSON.net. And to read my Huffington Post piece, you can just type in Charles Thomson Huffington Post, and it will be the first link that comes up.
Well, good work. All the best to you. I enjoy all of your writing, and may the truth prevail.
Well, thank you for having me. Like I say, you're the only person in the media so far who has come to me since the Huffington Post piece was published at all. Positive or negative, you're just the only person who's even bothered to contact me. I think the media often sweep this kind of thing under the carpet. Whenever anybody tries to discredit them, they just act like it isn't happening. If we close our eyes and put our fingers in our ears, then it will just go away.
Thank you, Charles. We have to move on to the next programmer, but all the best to you, and thank you so much for the work that you've done. And we'll be speaking with you again. Thank you. Bye-bye.